Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined with Malik Abdul, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. I want to bring in our guests. We have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a historian and award-winning author of more than 30 books, who currently holds the Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research has addressed issues of race and a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, and war. Dr. Horne, welcome to the show. How are you doing this morning?
Fine, thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for joining us. Easily one of my favorite people to interview. So I'm definitely glad you could join us. And so let's start with the African Summit. And this was the summit that Joe Biden basically had at the White House. He was trying to, let's say, renew connections with with the United States and African nations. And a lot of this, I would imagine, has to do with a lot of paranoia around the closeness and let's say, the investment from China into Africa, or for that matter, for Russia into Africa. In which case, Biden has made all sorts of promises. So right here, nearly 50 leaders made the trip to Washington, D.C., praised Biden for the 3-day event and included a commitment of $55 billion in American spending in Africa over 3 years, as well as a dozen business deals and initiatives in such things like technology, space, cybersecurity, food security, and the environment. The catch is, though, when you're reading through the article, what you find is a certain level of skepticism running through this entirety of this meeting. That no, they're not going to say anything bad to Biden overtly, but they are asking questions like Biden is trying to push us into the war thing, meaning they want us to take a side, or Biden wants us to pick a side between Russia or China for that matter. And for the most part, we don't want to do that. Give me your take on this summit. Do you think my appraisal of this is correct? That all things being equal, a lot of this has to do with Biden feeling China and Russia and the competition of those countries, especially in the sense of Africa itself?
You are certainly making a solid point. And I would not only add to China and Russia the fact that Turkey increasingly is playing a pivotal role in Africa. And as you know, relations between Ankara and Washington have not been ideal. Keep in mind, for example, that in Somalia, on the Horn of Africa, Turkey is probably the most important country in that nation. That is to say, it does everything from provide security at the airport to pick up the garbage. In fact, in these numerous African nations that have a Muslim plurality or majority, you increasingly find Turkish interests. And that's not to mention the role of India. If you look at the east coast of Africa from, say, Kenya, Mombasa, down to Durban, through Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean coast, you find large South Asian-derived populations, and increasingly you'll find Indian interests as well. And so the United States, as well as the other North Atlantic countries, they realize instinctively that the way they were catapulted into the pole position on planet Earth as being the so-called leading nations is because the centuries-long exploitation of Africa, either through the unlimited African slave trade or the looting and plundering of African resources. And now they see that that's being challenged. It's being challenged at a moment when the North Atlantic countries, particularly the Western European countries, find themselves in the uncomfortable position of being compelled to boycott Russian energy, particularly petroleum, which means more reliance on Nigerian and Angolan and Algerian petroleum, likewise with regard to boycotting Russian natural gas. So all in all, this summit that just took place in Washington this past week was a response to this crisis that one finds in the North Atlantic countries with regard to their prospective role in the global political economy.
Exceptional point. Exceptional point. I mean, I noticed even at the summit that was taking place in California, where it was what is it called, Nations of America, basically Latin American countries or South American countries. It was the same thing. It was this hint or this impression that the U.S. felt this kind of hegemonic control waning. And it was almost as if Biden was trying to ingratiate himself to all of these other nations, knowing full well that China is in the back end with all sorts of investments and everything else, making inroads to the various countries themselves. I mean, from the standpoint of the promises that Biden has been making here, he's talking about millions or billions of investment. He's also talking about, what is it, G20, allowing Africa to become part of the G20 as a, what do they call it, a permanent member of the G20. Are these Are these gains enough? Meaning, is this enough to kind of bring, let's say, to ingratiate America to Africa in this sense? Or, like they said before in the documentation, well, America has made these big deals before. And even bringing up Obama, saying Obama was making big promises and plans like this. Give me your take on that.
Well, I don't think it's enough. Does not even rise to the level of PEPFAR, the health initiative from the former U.S. President George W. Bush, or even Power Africa, the 2014 initiative under President Obama. What Mr. Biden has done is basically a grab bag of various initiatives, but even if you add up the numbers and assume that they're accurate, which is doubtful, they hardly hold a candle to what China is doing in Africa, particularly with regard to building of infrastructure, an important rail line in Ethiopia, an important rail line in Kenya. We're talking about the building of the African Union headquarters, the Trans-African Pan-Continental grouping of the continent in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. But in any case, it's difficult to take U.S. promises seriously because if you look at U.S. policy toward Zimbabwe, the Southern African nation, which soared to independence in 1980, you get a glimpse of the contradictions of Washington's policy. What I mean is that there was a representative of Zimbabwe at the summit, but unlike other African nations, there was not the representative of President Mnangagwa. Why is that, you ask? Well, some years ago, Zimbabwe moved to reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by taking back land from European invaders who had only arrived in the late 19th century compared to the European invaders of South Africa who arrived in 1652. And as a result of that land reform initiative, we saw the slapping of very stiff and punishing sanctions on Zimbabwe, not only by the former colonizing power, speaking of Britain, but followed by the United States and, of course, Australia as well. And that was a signal to Namibia and South Africa that they dare not embark on the road of land reform because they, too, have a very skewed maldistribution of land ownership, featuring Namibia, for example, which in size is as large as the size of California and Texas combined, even though it only has a paltry population of 3 million. But the land is dominated, ownership, that is to say, by the German invaders from the early part of the 20th century, and of course, Afrikaner invaders after the South Africans took over what was called German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, at the end of World War I, about 100 years ago. And so because Washington is afraid of folks in the United States getting the bright idea that they too can reverse the fruits of settler colonialism by having land cessions back to the original inhabitants, speaking of the indigenous and the Native American populations, these sanctions on Zimbabwe have not been lifted. In fact, they've been increased. And that does not go down very well in Africa because Zimbabwe is in good books with the African Union. It is considered a leading Pan-African nation, and it's also one of China's chief allies on the continent. So Washington is ensnared in contradictions and seeking to embark on a policy towards Africa.
Dr. Horne, many African countries retain strong ties to Russia, I think probably dating back to the Soviet Union and their support for independence movement during the Cold War. But is the reason you were talking about sanctions, it seems as if that the U.S. has lost influence in Africa over recent years to the benefit of countries like Russia and China. Russia, we know, has been investing in military, but also mining and energy projects in Africa. Is this what you were talking about with the sanctions and the U.S.'s contradictory relationship with Africa? Does that help explain how Africa has developed closer ties with Russia and China?
Well, certainly the point that you make about Moscow's ties to Africa, stretching back to the Soviet days, needs to be reinforced. But I would add the footnote that it actually stretches back to the pre-1917 days as well. That is to say, before the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union. If you look at the history of Ethiopia, for example, that rare African nation that was able to escape colonialism, one of the reasons was that in the 1890s, when you had an Italian invasion, Ethiopia was able to resist that invasion because it was armed to the teeth by Russia. This has something to do with the fact that Russia had contradictions and problems with many Western European nations, and it felt that undermining Western European nations at the root and the source of their wealth, speaking of the plundering of Africa, was in their best interest. This policy, in a sense, continues post-1917. In fact, if you look at the history of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, if you look at the literature, for example, if you look at the recent book by the South African analyst Tom Lodge, Lodge, his book Red Road to Freedom, you'll find that both the African National Congress and its ally, the South African Communist Party, were financed very handsomely by Moscow. You had cadre trained in guerrilla war tactics, not only in Moscow, but in what was then called the German Democratic Republic. You had scholarships for training of technicians who are now playing a leading role in the South African economy. And so there is not a problem of amnesia amongst the militants in South Africa. They recall their history. They recall that at a time when Moscow was helping to support that struggle, U.S. imperialism was in bed with apartheid, and that U.S. corporations were seeking to benefit from the cheap labor of African workers enforced by apartheid. And so that is the history that haunts this summit that's taking place in Washington, because, as you well know, South Africa was not just an issue for South Africans, it was conceived as a holy cause for the continent as a whole. And so from Cairo to the Cape, Africa has not forgotten the inglorious, in fact, the despicable role of U.S. imperialism before the coming to independence of South Africa under Nelson Mandela in 1994.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it always amazes me that it's as if they don't believe that history was real, if that makes sense. What I mean by that is the administration tries to, I guess, make inroads, but they miss the fact that many of these other countries that they're basically trying to push back against have been there for years and has been investing a ton of money, not just in this kind of reactive investment that seems to be taking place with Biden, trying to, solidify the position of America around the globe. Give me your take on that for the moment. This notion that there seems to be a shift where this kind of singular polarity or this monopolarity has changed into multipolarity. And, many of the other countries where we talk about China, for that matter, Russia, you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, you talk about Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you're finding a rival economic order that seems to be evolving into the other countries around the world, not the West. Meaning, from the standpoint of Europe, for example, Europe is taking it in the teeth. I mean, the reporting that's coming out of there is astonishing. I mean, Britain, the UK, coming up with warm spaces because they don't believe that they're going to be able to keep their people warm. You're talking about people cutting down power from the standpoint of churches, people not being able to pay their power bills, or for that matter, even inflation around the issues of food. Whereas you're looking at what seems to be an ascendant rest of the world. I mean, do you see this change taking place? And do you see it escalating as time goes forward? And for that matter, do you even think the U.S. has anything in its toolbox to be able to, let's say, hold back the night, in a sense, in the way that we're probably looking at it?
That's highly doubtful, and that helps to shed light and explain why the United States is seeking to entice Africa per this summit, assuring Africa that it will receive a permanent seat at the Group of 20 meeting, the G20 meetings, that through the good offices of the African Union. They just met, as you know, in Bali, Indonesia. There has been talk from the White House about having a permanent representative of Africa on the Security Council of the United Nations, the top table of the international system. The African Union says it wants 2 seats, not just one, so that is going to cause problems with Washington. And then you see the de-dollarization movement, which received a bump as a result of the visit in the last few days of President Xi Jinping to Saudi Arabia, just across the Red Sea, by the way, from Somalia and Ethiopia, thereby highlighting the importance of those two African nations. What I'm talking about is the fact that Saudi Arabia, the major oil supplier globally, instituted a system some years ago, the so-called petrodollar system, where any nation which sought to buy a barrel of petroleum had to have U.S. dollars. Well, increasingly, Saudi Arabia is moving towards de-dollarization, telling the Chinese, for example, that it will be possible in the future to buy petroleum through the Chinese renminbi or the yuan. Even in Ghana, a West African nation of less than 36 million people, you see that as they face pressure from the vultures of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, that there is increasing discussion of Ghana recalling its past name, the Gold Coast, the pre-1957, pre-independence name of Ghana, and trying to obtain petroleum and other valuable commodities through gold, which is another form of de facto de-dollarization. Dollarization, of course, was a major asset, or has been a major asset for U.S. imperialism. De-dollarization will be a major blow to U.S. imperialism. Hence, you see this scramble for influence in Africa by this summit, this conference that took place this week in Washington, D.C.
Professor, I want to move over to a bit to Ethiopia. And we followed this struggle that was taking place in Ethiopia between, well, it's even weird to say because Tigray is part of a region of Ethiopia. So, but I guess you can call it a civil war of sorts. And so there was a peace agreement that was basically signed. And right here, it's an agreement signed with fanfare in South Africa on the eve of the war's second anniversary, calls for the full disarmament of Tigray's forces within 30 days, according to the copy of the final deal, which has not been published but was obtained by the Times. It says that senior commanders from both sides are to meet within 5 days to figure out how disarmament will happen. The deal also paves way for Ethiopia's federal troops to enter Tigray's regional capital, Mekelle, in a manner that is expeditious, smooth, peaceful, and coordinated. Now, before we get to the peace deal in and of itself, I want to go with Ethiopia and the way that the U.S. basically treated Ethiopia. Ethiopia was attacked by the TPLF, an organization that basically ran the government for like 28 years, if I'm not mistaken, under a military dictatorship. The U.S. and the response of the U.S. was basically to act as if the government of Ethiopia wasn't attacked and frame it as if the Ethiopian government was the aggressor. It was very weird and warped. Biden went so far as to even talk about sanctions against the country itself, basically going after Abiy Ahmed in this case. How does that affect, meaning all of the other countries in Africa, I would imagine, had to see what was taking place. How does that affect any kind of relationship with the United States and the African nation, knowing that the U.S. was willing to take this particular position with Ethiopia on something that Ethiopia didn't start?
Many of the problems in the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, not excluding Somalia, stretch back to the Cold War, when Ethiopia in the mid-1970s, after the overthrow of the so-called Emperor Haile Selassie, was perceived as being a Soviet ally. Therefore, Washington induced Somalia, which had also had a positive relation with Moscow, to attack Ethiopia over a territorial disagreement over the Ogaden region that borders both countries. And you saw Somalia then descend into a spiral from which it has yet to recover. And you also saw the overthrow of the then existing regime of Addis Ababa and the coming to power, as you noted, of the TPLF, whose administration has been subjected to sharp criticism. And of course, as we know, they were replaced by the new regime headed by Abiy Ahmed, who was in Washington just this past week, meeting with high-level officials. The agreements inked in South Africa have been thought to have brought a close to the essence of this conflict, but it's not clear if that's the case because, number one, Eritrea, which had been part of Ethiopia, but is now independent, was not a signatory to this agreement, and Eritrea has been close to the regime in Addis Ababa after years of discord and turmoil. And with their not being a signatory, they're not necessarily bound by this accord. But if you step back from the Horn of Africa and look more broadly at the continent and try to place the summit within the context of this broad perspective, you see that Washington is encountering many difficulties stemming precisely from that Cold War escapade, the post-1945 increase in tensions with Moscow, because we know that before this summit that took place this week, Washington was visited by French President Emmanuel Macron. France, as you know, is a major vampire of the African continent. That is to say, its pretensions to being a major power basically rest upon its continuing exploitation of nations like Guinea-Conakry, not invited to the summit, Mali, not invited to the summit, Burkina Faso, not invited to the summit, not to mention close French allies like Niger, invited to the summit. Washington feels compelled to stand by its longtime ally in France, providing satellite assets and other assets so that France can continue to exploit the African nations, particularly in the Sahel region, that is to say, the region stretching from West Africa to the northern cone of the continent. And that exploitation does not go down very well with many leaders throughout the continent, and thereby it complicates relations that Washington is trying to avoid, complicating relations with Africa, that is to say, because of this pre-existing close relationship with the so-called ally in France.
Give me your take on this peace deal. I mean, for all intents and purposes, like you said, this war had been going on, I think 2 years, give or take. Why do you think, why did the U.S. take the tack that it took? And what I mean by that is, even in U.S. media, for the most part, they were reporting this in a very warped and weird way. So much so that Ethiopians were extremely angry about how they were reporting this, and for that matter, even Biden. Youngkin, for example, I think there were 700, maybe 100,000 Ethiopians, Eritreans that were in Virginia. Well, those voters typically vote Democrat. They turned around and decided not to vote Democrat that year in order to punish the Democratic Party. Youngkin ends up winning by like 60,000 votes, which is basically the number of people of that particular group, either Eritrea or, for that matter, Ethiopia. Why did the U.S. take this kind of warped tact backing the TPLF in this conflict?
Well, as already suggested, Washington has broad and vast interests in that region that stretch far beyond Ethiopia. I've already referenced its issues and interests in Saudi Arabia just across the Red Sea, due west in Sudan, which once enjoyed the reputation of being the largest nation by territory on the African continent before, under George W. Bush, Washington was able to execute the secession of South Sudan, now an independent nation, from the larger Sudan. Sudan is racked with turmoil between a military junta and a restive civilian population. And Sudan is a major supplier of energy. Sudan was also part of a larger Washington scheme, the so-called Abraham Accords under former U.S. President Mr. Trump, whereby you had a number of North African nations, including Morocco and not excluding Sudan, who were being enticed to broker positive diplomatic relations with Israel. However, that did not go down very well in Sudan. It has not gone down very well in Morocco either. And in return, Sudan was being forced to cough up a significant amount of capital, supposedly because of Sudan's previous support for those now deemed to be terrorists who once were considered to be freedom fighters. I'm speaking of diverse interests, including one Osama bin Laden, who once had a residence in Sudan. So Washington has multiple and various, and in fact, conflicting interests in that part of Africa. And in any case, with regard to your point concerning the victory of Glenn Youngkin, to the extent that that story proves to be accurate, that the residents of Virginia who have roots in the Horn of Africa helped to push Youngkin across the finish line, I hope that they do not live to regret that momentous decision.
Interesting. Well, I, many of the people who were in Ethiopia that I would run across, because, in DC, it's somewhat of a melting pot, they were very angry. Like, to put it mildly, they were extremely angry. So, yeah. But I want to thank you for this, actually, because like I said, I think I've said it once before, I always enjoy you coming on to the show and having these conversations. So I appreciate this. Dr. Gerald Horne, he's a historian and award-winning author of more than 30 books, who currently holds the Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. His research has addressed issues of race in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, and, of course, issues of war and peace. Excellent.